So first, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. My name is Bret Schafer. I'm a senior fellow and the head of the information manipulation team at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. Our panel today, the hope is really to move away from the comparative analysis that we've been doing the last 5 years, looking at tactics and techniques from Iran, Russia, and China, and looking more at the democratic responses to the information manipulation threat. So the idea behind the panel really came out of the fact that I think there's really general fatigue among the disinfo community at simply defining and redefining the problem over and over. And there's a sense that we continue to spend way more time focusing on the problem than really looking at the solutions and whether or not those solutions have been effective. And perhaps more importantly, the democratic implications of some of the solutions that have been proposed and in some cases already implemented. Because we're now kind of 5 years into discussing this topic, into this topic really becoming kind of a global phenomena. And we have seen various interventions from the technology companies to governments, but there hasn't, I don't think, been adequate discussion and debate about whether those policies have worked. So what we're going to look at today is really have what we have already put in place, has that been effective? Have some of those interventions backfired in some ways? And more importantly, should we be doing something entirely different? So joining me on the panel today are a group of experts who have experience tackling this problem inside and adjacent to government, from civil society, from the private sector as well. We're also pulling in expertise from Asia Pacific to Europe to the United States. So we should be covering a lot of ground in the hour today. So I'm going to introduce the panelists here kind of from east to west geographically. So first we have Puma Shen, who's joining us from Taiwan. So Puma is the director of DoubleThink Lab in Taipei. He is also an assistant professor at National Taipei University. Moving over to Europe, we have Anneli Ahonen, who is most recently a senior fellow at ISD Global and the former head of East Stratcom Task Force and the European External Action Service at the EU, and also worked on EU versus Disinfo. Then joining me today in DC, although of course virtually, is Lee Foster, who's the Senior Vice President with Althea Group and the former Director of Information Operations Analysis at Mandiant FireEye. And then moving to the West Coast, so joining us early is Renée DiResta. Renée is a research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory. She, of course, was one of the authors of the Senate Intelligence Report on Russian IRA activity in the 2016 election. She also wrote about GRU activity. So we have a sort of wide range of expertise here. And just to give you a little sense about how the conversation is going to take place today, we are going to sort of forgo any introductory remarks from each of the panelists because we have 4 people. We only have an hour. Most of us on the panel have heard each other speak countless times. So we're just going to kind of dive right into the conversation. I'm going to use my power as the moderator here to start directing questions to the various panelists. That's probably going to last about 40, 45 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the crowd. So first, I want to turn to Puma, because Taiwan, of course, has a reputation as being both firmly in the crosshairs of sort of CCP disinformation, information campaigns, but perhaps because of that, also being an incredibly resilient society to information operations. So I guess the first question is that reputation justified? And if it is, what has Taiwan done from a government civil society perspective to push back against informations, and what have they done to be effective?
Thanks, Fred. Thanks for the question. I mean, thanks for having me today. So I think Taiwan has been a testing ground for CCP information operations since 1949. So I think it's fair to say that we're quite experienced in this case, but it doesn't mean that we're more resilient than other countries. So like in 2018, signing a peace agreement with China is quite a topic in Taiwan. And according to the 2018 survey conducted by Academic Institute here in Taiwan, 60% of Taiwanese chose economic interests over national security. So this was the survey after the Sunflower Movement in 2014, which is the essentially anti-China movement. So I think in a traditional Taiwanese citizens' minds, we're aware of Chinese threat, but it has been so long that everyone was too used to it. It was the result of the 2018 election that really changed our mindset. The candidate who got elected were too pro-China, and Xi Jinping's speech in early 2019 were too harsh that create counter-forces from our side. So in the mid of 2019, there was a huge campaign in Taipei which fight against the media that are too pro-China. And the survey conducted again in 2019, 60% of Taiwanese now chose national security over economic interest. And the survey was even conducted before the demonstration in Hong Kong. So think about how like the NBA incident changed some of Americans' thoughts on China. I mean, several events in 2018 and 2019 also really changed Taiwanese mind. So I think the next question here is that what's the government's role or civil society's role in this change? So civil society responds to the threat at the very beginning. So the fact checkers, the organizations like us who focus on cyber army already started to work after Sunflower movement in 2014. However, people did not really care about us since China was not the hot topic from 2015 to 2018. So what is fair to say is that it is the DPP along with the election running, raised the public awareness in 2019. And when this niche created by DPP emerged, what has been done by civil society soon fit in. So the civil society also tries to keep adequate distance from the government. And such a practice helps civil society actors like us earn the trust of the general public in terms of independence and integrity. So I can go on and to discuss how we stop the disinformation flow or money flow from China, but I think I'll answer the question here, so we have more discussion along the way.
So I want to talk about one specific thing that was passed in Taiwan that created a little bit of controversy, and that's the Anti-Infiltration Act. And my understanding of it is it's an effort to keep Chinese money and Chinese influence out of politics, but also out of Taiwanese media. Do you think that was necessary? Of course, I think a critic would say if this were implemented in Russia, which it sort of sounds, at least on the surface, like their Foreign Agents Act, do you have concerns that this kind of policy implemented from the government could be sort of warped by authoritarian countries to really crack down on free expression at home?
Right. I think, yeah. So I got both law degrees in Taiwan and the US, so I think I'm okay to answer that question. So I think it's certainly not like anti-democratic, and actually all clauses from the anti-infiltration law in Taiwan are clauses that already exist in our regulations. So for example, it is prohibited to bribe the politicians. And of course, I believe in every democratic country has the same clause. So the anti-infiltration law in Taiwan only moved the clause to the new law, the anti-infiltration law, and specified the bribe from country that wants to infiltrate us, like China, and saying that they should especially be prohibited and punished. So the only thing that we did is to move the clause into one law and raise the penalty a little bit. So I have to say that even the anti-infiltration law is not anti-democratic. It's neither a good idea. So first, you need evidence to prosecute, since infiltration is a criminal act. So you need like 100 evidence, otherwise you have to presume innocence. And unfortunately, this kind of evidence is hard to acquire. And second, if you choose to punish, then it means you're waiting until the harm has been done, then you take action. And this is extremely useless in the case of disinformation. Right? And actually, since free speech is highly valued in Taiwan, we do not really put any disinformation clause in that anti-infiltration law, which means that we're missing the most important part of information operation. So that being said, using administrative actions such as like transparency or any other approach to urge transparency will be much better than the anti-infiltration law.
All right, I'm going to kind of transition over to Europe now. So Anneli, I guess pivoting right from Puma, you kind of formally ran some of the EU's counter-disinformation work. From your perch there, do you think the bloc is still pretty much exclusively focused on Russia as the main threat, or have they woken up a little bit to the threat of Chinese information manipulation as well?
Thank you, Bret, and thanks for having me today here. So if you look at like the whole EU's response to disinformation, it sort of has different strands. Stratcom, raising awareness, funding civil society projects, and then work with platforms, and now the upcoming Digital Services Act and regulation. And then when we moved to actor-specific work, what has enabled this type of quite bold Stratcom and raising awareness, like EU versus Disinfo on Russia, has been the unified political backing and mandate from the member states. And this is the part that the China work is lacking. So while there is this type of awakening among some of the member states and in Brussels, like a positive signal is that there are several people now working on following specifically Chinese actions and having the regional language knowledge. But what is lacking is this type of strong political backbone that would then enable this type of more bold action from the EU side.
So looking just at Russia, do you think the EU's collective response has deterred Russia? I mean, looking at the Skripal incidents, many other incidents going back 4 or 5 years, do you think Russia today is any more reticent to conduct interference in the EU than they were in 2015, 2016? And if they're not, what do you think the EU should be doing to create a greater disincentive for Russia to continue to interfere in EU affairs?
Well, it's of course probably not the part that we can be extremely proud of or can boast here of preventing or deterring Russia's hostile actions towards the EU and EU member states. What has been done, again, I think that like keeping continuously Russian states, the Kremlin accountable for their actions publicly. I think that has been a strong signal, and not allowing like completely free playground in like information space wise, for example, in crucial regions like Eastern Partnership, Ukraine, and elsewhere. Now, when it comes to this type of more on the deterrence side or sanctioning, here you can see that, for example, that there has been sanctions like Skilb is on EU sanction list, Prigozhin is on EU sanction list, not on the basis of disinformation, but on other grounds. And then some member states, like the Baltic states, have banned, for example, Russia Today on the grounds of the Skilb sanctions. So this type of further implementation of these existing sanctions is one way that could be taken more widely into action. And then the other thing that could be now implemented more widely would be the EU cyber sanction toolbox that, for example, in the future could include hacking campaigns that potentially could have at least some kind of deterrence effect.
Do you think any of the individual member states have been more effective than others at pushing back when you look at sort of the domestic national response? And if so, is there something that can be adopted more sort of block-wide?
Well, again, I think we have to look into the East and to the Baltic states, and of course, I come from Finland, and the Nordic countries have traditionally been quite effective in this as well. Now on the Baltic states, I think that what is very like effectively done there is both like this rapid operational reaction to disinformation campaigns to kill them at the origin, sort of, and then at the same time taking longer term actions, and probably the other member states could like where we could then learn would be that not at least allow like completely free highway and allow more broadcast licenses for open Russian propaganda channels like RT and so forth. So to at least stop that kind of giving free highway.
So I'm going to turn now to the US, and Renée, I'll start with you here. There's obviously been very little legislative movement over the last 4+ years to do much about state-backed disinformation. I guess the one thing that has been proposed that even hasn't moved is the Honest Ads Act, and that of course would only look at sort of a small sliver of paid ads, which of course is a drop in the bucket when you look at organic content. So I guess it's a two-part question. One, is there anything in the legislative pipeline in the US that you think could have a positive effect in terms of our pushback? And then two, and I guess this is the more important question, should we be looking at government and government legislation as being a solution here?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the panel. I don't see very much coming out of Congress, no. There was, I think, back in 2019, Representative Stratcom had a few bills to try to make it illegal for foreign actors to purchase campaign ads, to require candidates to report foreign offers of information. So we had a few things kind of back then, but we haven't seen very much in the way of legislative momentum. This is partly because it became a very politicized topic in Congress, for possibly obvious reasons following the investigation into the 2016 interference, the inability to differentiate between interference and collusion among large numbers of extremely tribal legislators. So that became a real kind of locking horns point where Republicans who expressed an interest in addressing this problem, this was somehow seen as giving credence to the idea that something had happened in 2016. It had, it just not to perhaps the extent of the political conversation about it. So I think at this point, to answer the second part of the question, a lot of what is happening is establishment of responses and a recognition that it is going to be kind of an ongoing threat. You can legislate against it, but there's always going to be entities and actors that are trying to manipulate the system. And so the question becomes, are there ways to identify and counter or identify and respond to, or even just more quickly identify those entities? And to that end, we've seen, our team at Stanford ran a project called the Election Integrity Partnership in 2020. And we were not focused specifically on detecting foreign interference. We were looking at narratives, false and misleading narratives and claims related to voting writ large, regardless of who they came from. But in the course of that, of course, we did see the Iranian content that I think we'll touch on later in this panel. We did see some, some kind of light spammy attempts from China and some kind of, kind of ineffectual efforts by Russia. And so we did see some of these things kind of nipping at the margins of the conversation. And what we had put together was this interinstitution effort to try to make sure that lawmakers and Congress and the entities like the Department of Homeland Security and others had some situational awareness about what was going on. So this wasn't a legislative effort. This was more of a whole of society approach, trying to build those connections between researchers, government, civil society that sees the information coming into their communities, and tech platforms that sees the information on their platforms, trying to think through what can we do independent of regulation, recognizing how in the US it's become a very, very challenging thing to accomplish, and looking more at what can those of us in society actually do.
So a follow-up question there, and this actually kind of builds off something Anneli mentioned about making it a little bit harder for the RTs of the world to gain licenses to broadcast in countries that are targeted by Russian information campaigns. One thing that the US has done is sort of ramped up efforts around the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA. RT, Sputnik, Chinese media outlets, they've had to register. It's sort of my sense that hasn't had much real teeth other than sort of mandating a little bit more transparency. But what it has done, has been used by the Kremlin to crack down pretty significantly on Western media outlets. So from where you sit, is FARA an effective tool at all? Could it be an effective tool if we actually added some teeth to it? Or is it just something that actually gives cover to authoritarians to crack down on our own media outlets?
Well, I think, it's an interesting question. I think that I appreciate that it focuses on media, not just social media. I think these two things are quite blended, right? A lot of the way that foreign broadcast reaches external public today, Russia broadcasting into the US, China broadcasting globally, you name it, pick a Russia broadcasting globally, is actually on social media. So social media is just another part of the channel strategy of state media. I think that some of what we saw over the last 2 years, actually sort of following on after the Hong Kong protests and Taiwan election, really was, I think, where you started to see tech platforms begin to realize the extent to which, and COVID, of course, was the other kind of big topical shift in early 2020, where the platforms began to realize that that they had to do more to come up with some sort of application of, what would that principle look like applied to this new broadcast, this new kind of mass media sphere of social media. And the question of how efficacious something is very difficult for us to measure, particularly in the context of broadcast media on its various channels. That's not something that we look at, so I don't have a particularly strong answer on that front. The one thing I will say is we did see a crackdown on state media buying ads and pushing them out undisclosed, which was a thing that was very much happening during COVID. It was a thing where state media wanting to push their particular point of view on where COVID had originated or what it was, or who was handling it better, was using Facebook ad buys to do that. So that label, also one thing that we saw that was interesting is as Twitter labeled not only the broadcast outlets themselves, but also the principals at those channels, you started to see a lot of complaining, a lot of complaining from the people who were labeled, arguing that their reach had dropped, their impact had dropped. People were responding to their tweets with, yeah, but of course you would say that you're Chinese state media, and and such commentary. And they were very upset about this, and so it was sort of an interesting, an interesting data point that it had, in fact, that they had noticed a shift in their distribution, but also in ways that the viewing public was responding to their commentary. And so I do think that the benefit really is an informed audience. And while we sort out to what extent, there are a lot of really, there are a lot of questions, particularly for authoritarian countries that don't allow US media to broadcast in, or don't allow their own citizens to view content on social media, period, let alone their own, why they have that platform, right? Why we're giving them that platform. The counter to that is America's always had this pluralistic media environment, and as long as the people were informed, they could make a determination about the originator of the content and what that bias might mean and how they should process the message. I do think we see that the latter is happening, judging by the response, the complaints of the people. But this is very kind of small scale anecdotal evidence. I don't know that anybody's really studied it in great detail systematically.
So there's 2 points you made there I want to get back to. One is labeling state media accounts or diplomatic accounts. The other is, looking more at, now I'm sort of forgetting the second point, but I will remember it when I actually get back to it. But first, I do want to bring in Lee, because he's obviously been sitting there quietly for a bit, and he has, I think, a very unique perspective here, because he did a lot of the work early on looking at Iranian information operations, particularly cyber-enabled Iranian information operations, before many other people were looking in that space, especially before 2020. And it's my sense, but Lee, correct me if I'm wrong here, that the US government has been more willing to go after Iranian assets, particularly Iranian media outlets. And I'm thinking specifically of the DOJ or the FBI's decision to take down Press TV, other state-linked media websites. So the first question, and I ask this knowing that you're not privy to all of the conversations taking place within government, but why has the US government been willing or able to go after Iranian assets more than Russian and Chinese assets? And then the second part of the question is, should the government be doing more of that to take down hostile media networks?
Thanks, Bret, and good morning, everyone. So I think to answer your first question, an important thing to keep in mind is that the relevant legal vehicles existed such that the US government could take action against these Iranian domains. And you may recall back prior to the 2020 election, there were a couple of sets of DOJ seizures related to the large-scale IUVM network. I think in the first, 92 domains were taken down, and in the second, in early November, 27 domains were taken down. So you're talking about over 100 domains there. Only 8 of those were considered kind of directly targeting US audiences, and so were actually seized due to violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. The rest of them, the legal vehicles that existed to take those down are due to US sanctions against Iran. And so these other domains were able to be seized because they were using US domain registrars, top-level domains, and so on, and didn't have the appropriate OFAC licenses. And so obviously in the Iranian case, there's this kind of special circumstance where this level of sanctions exists such that there are these other avenues to take these down. It's interesting, of course, that you mentioned FARA earlier with relation to other states, because now with those states registering under FARA, if your end goal is to take them down, I say that, judgment agnostic. If your end goal is to take that down, you've now removed that as a legal vehicle with which to take action. In terms of, could the government be doing more? Should the government be doing more? I'd perhaps ask you to humor my cynicism a little bit here. I do think that they certainly could. I think about the timeliness and the timing of the Iranian domain takedowns. These occur right before the 2020 election. There's obviously a lot of attention being paid to what is the US government going to do to protect this election, following all the issues that occurred back in 2016. And so, these domains really send a message that the US government is protecting our elections, they're taking action, we're stopping hostile foreign actors from trying to influence our domestic politics. However, all of those domains were exposed publicly 3 years prior. So it took a long time to get to that stage. I think, I have questions, is that just the fact that these investigations take so long in order to get to that point where you can take action, or was there more involved in the timing of these? So I certainly think that if the government is interested in taking action against assets like this, they can certainly do so in a more timely manner, invest more resources in being able to conduct these investigations at scale, so that even after exposure, these assets aren't kind of sitting there, continuing their activities for years prior to being actioned.
I guess the other part of that equation too is my sense is Iranian assets were not particularly effective at influencing Americans, unlike RT that actually has an audience. Press TV, if they had an audience, it was quite small. And the takedown, I think, created a propaganda opportunity that not only the Iranians jumped on, but we saw Russians, RT, Chinese state media, and others using that to paint America as just, another country that's willing to suppress critical dissent and, opposing points of view. So, I guess, is there a concern there if our strategy here, and not just from the government perspective, but I think we're going to transition now to platform responses. If our strategy is to continually take things down, are we kind of getting ourselves on a slippery slope?
Quite possibly. You call out RT, for example, and I see, people regularly sharing RT articles, know exactly where it's from, but, see it as a completely valid news source, right? And so that does beg the question, then, where do you draw that line? It's not enough in such a circumstance to merely be state-owned or, have state influence over it. So potentially, yeah. I think the government could do a lot more to really identify where those boundaries are and stand up the relevant legal vehicles, to ensure consistency of enforcement actions.
So kind of pivoting from that point, as I mentioned, I want to kind of transition from government responses to platform responses. So Anneli, you and I worked on a German election project that focused pretty heavily on what Russia was doing in Germany. The sort of content that they were pushing out. And one of the things that was very apparent is the content that was gaining a lot of engagement, a lot of traction across various social media platforms tended to exist in the world of sort of anti-public health, anti-vaccine, anti-mask, anti-lockdown. And eventually that led to a suspension by YouTube that then became a permanent ban after they tried to circumvent that suspension by posting to another channel. So from your perspective, sitting in the EU, do the YouTubes and Facebooks and Twitters of the world need to, do they need to be doing more kind of outside of government mandates to take down some of these accounts, some of these outlets, if they are violating the rules of the platform?
Thanks. I mean, I think that this example of German RT YouTube takedown is quite interesting, because in a way it's also referring back to what Lee was saying about like government stepping up the like where the boundaries of a certain legal action go, because I think like if by German law broadcasting a foreign state funded so-called media like RT is not possible, and hence RT hasn't got a broadcasting license for their German language channel, then why would you be able to do very similar type of content on YouTube in German language for millions of Germans, and then like pass to the platform, to YouTube, decision when to take it down? So I think in general, of course, like in this case, when RT has been spreading disinformation, manipulated content, especially on vaccinations and COVID, and has grown its audiences, it's good that it's taken down. But the trouble is that it's not consistent. It's intransparent. Like the argumentation behind it. Why RT in Germany? Why not RT in France, where RT does have a broadcasting license? So these type of decisions where the legislation covers traditional media, but not the social media platforms.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And so Puma, when we talk about platform responses, I think from the sort of US-centric perspective, we tend to think only about the big three. There are obviously many others, some of which are particularly popular in Taiwan. I know Line, for instance, is a very popular platform there. So first, can you talk a little bit about platforms outside of Google, Twitter, Facebook that are used in Taiwan that have been vectors for influence in the past, and what kind of Taiwan civil society and the government have done to work with those platforms to try to push back against Chinese info ops?
Sure. I'll try to be brief here. So Line is very similar to WhatsApp. So it's the most popular private-to-private chat apps in Taiwan. And actually, you can guess like how many messages like Taiwanese people send like messages per day online. It's 9.2 billion. So it's quite a lot. So certainly it's like a platform for disinformation dissemination, but people in Taiwan really generate new content on it. So most of the information spreads are still the URL, the links from YouTube, or screenshot from Facebook and Twitter. So if you want to target the origin of the disinformation, Line is certainly not the place, but it's the place that for amplifying all these messages. So, I mean, being a major platform for messages, we still need to do something. So civil society like Kofax and the fact checkers like MyGoPen, which means don't lie to me in Taiwanese, they actually create the bot, like the machine that can be added to the chat group. And the bot will automatically look at the URL or messages that match their rumor database. So if the messages match, the system will automatically push correct information to the chat group. So even without the bot, the users can also report the case to civil society group. So we will know that what's the rumor that has been spread right now. And some of them even have like one-on-one chat room for people who wants to clarify the messages they receive. But I mean, if people are using the platform from China, let's say WeChat, then there's nothing we can do about it. And also, although our government is using the same strategy right now, they're creating their official line accounts to debunk the messages. It could backfire because the government is aware of the demassifying nature of modern media reception. So the policies depicted above were developed to reflect the diversity of audience groups and channels. But sometimes the government rush out debunking messages without prudent measures, and that may lead to erosion of public trust. And the government once also provided the response materials containing factual errors. And in another incident, our government provided the materials to one pro-government online influencers, and the influencer released those materials prior to the government, and which further led to the critics of favoritism and propaganda among the publics. So, I mean, we're actually doing something right now, but there's still something to be aware of.
So before the next question, I did want to add, we probably got about 10 minutes left of me peppering our panelists with questions, and then we're going to open it to Q&A. So please start putting your questions in the chat box there, and then those will get filtered to me when we wrap up this part of the presentation. So Lee, I want to put you on the spot here. I'm going to promote you to the head of trust and safety at pick your big platform. So your Twitter, your Facebook, your head of trust and safety, you don't have to worry about in this sort of imaginary hypothetical world. Investors, you don't have to worry about Zuckerberg. You don't have to worry about political optics. What is the one thing you would do in that position that you think would be the most effective at disrupting state-backed information operations?
Well, first you describe a utopia I could only dream of, not being subject to all of these other restrictions and constraints. But I'd actually two spring to mind, if I may entertain those. And number one, I think being much more open in terms of sharing specific indicators for state attribution with trusted third-party researchers. It sounds cliche, but definitely in my experience, having fresh pairs of eyes come to these investigations opens them up so much further, helps you identify new assets, new tactics, new angles of activity, and so on. And so, being able to share as much as possible on that front, I think would go a long way to helping, my hypothetical platform, ensure we're capturing as much of this activity as possible. I think secondly, I would on the side of timeliness for enforcement activity. And if I retroactively have to then kind of reverse some of my decisions, do that. But, for example, there was an incident where I provided to a platform an Iranian asset that was purporting to be a Black Lives Matter advocate and activist. And we reported that, and it took ultimately about a year for the full investigation on their side to be conducted and for that asset to be taken down. And, that's a whole year that the assets like these have to continue to build audiences, to continue to try to, inject their political commentary into those audiences. And so, erring on the side of timeliness, taking down assets and then, reversing if needs be, I think would be an effective way to do this. Now, obviously, you've got to balance that with ensuring it's not abused. I think, we can see that a lot with Twitter's recent privacy policy that's been implemented, right, that such mechanisms are ripe for abuse as well. So maybe there's a middle ground there where it involves only notification from trusted third-party researchers. But I think, trying to shorten the time span from notification to enforcement would be an effective way to disrupt these networks.
So Renee, I want to ask you basically the same question, but I'm not going to give you the utopian world that Lee was allowed to live in. So you do actually have to respond to the political whims of politicians and to investors and everything else. So from a US-centric perspective right now, is there much the platforms can be doing, given that they're sort of damned if they do, damned if they don't? We saw obviously the fiasco around Hunter Biden's laptop this time around, when they actually tried to do something to correct the errors of 2016 around hack-in leaks, and the sort of fiasco that became. So given our current political climate, do you think there really is anything that the platforms can do that's not going to get them dragged up to Capitol Hill and beat around by politicians?
Well, I think as far as the last part, as far as get dragged up to Capitol Hill, I mean, that's one of the challenges in, where we are today. There's a lot of ref working, a lot of trying to jockey for, power by proxy, by, rallying your base, insinuating that the tech platforms are disproportionately targeting you. This is a thing that has been going on for quite some time now. And there are definitely ways in which content removal, I think, is done inelegantly and reactively. And then this is the challenge of in an information environment where things go viral so quickly. We either see, it seems, something where they lag for far too long, and then the thing is viral and they take it down, and there's a second wave of allegations of censorship. So there's almost the kind of the controversy about whatever the content was, followed by the controversy about the moderation decision. On the flip side, though, we have also seen a number of times where as something is breaking, the kind of immediate takedown or blocking of it is then found to not be something that we would have wanted to see. There's a period of time there where we would have wanted some more careful reflection in the form of a fact check, or in the context of COVID, perhaps something like, where is the real consensus on this? I think there's some refinement in the use of the remove, reduce, inform framework that we could see that platforms could do. There are, policies that, your colleague Karen Kornblatt and myself have advocated for in the context of things like circuit breakers. Are there ways in which, with a clear disclosure, not something that the American public is surprised by, but saying something along the lines of, for particular highly controversial types of content in high harm topical areas, we are going to throttle and then put out the results of what we find. We are going to use reduce alongside the fact check, and then make a determination after the fact. I think that transparency and communication is something that needs to happen, so that it looks a little bit less like there's a person in Facebook who has all of this power to determine what is going viral or not, and allegations that's subject to the partisan whims of the moderator. So I think in the near term, just having more of a clearly articulated policy structure around when remove, reduce, and inform are going to be used and how in these situations, and then sticking to the implementation of the policy is kind of the best path forward as we head into the 2022 elections here in the US.
So before I turn it over to Q&A, there are a couple questions I want to open to the entire group because it's something that we've been debating internally for a while. I've been debating my own sort of feelings on a couple of these proposals. So I'd love to get your collective thoughts. And this goes back to the thing that you mentioned earlier, Renee, that I forgot, that I now remember. And that's whether or not governments or officials in governments that do not allow their own citizens to be on Western social media platforms should be allowed to be on those platforms themselves. So I'm thinking specifically, obviously, of China's wolf warriors, the supreme leader of Iran. They obviously have huge audiences on Twitter. Their own population or average citizens in those countries are not able to be on those platforms. So should there be a policy at the platform level that if the general population is not able to access those platforms, government officials should not be allowed to access them either? And I open that to anyone who wants to jump in and take it. Renee, I'll put you on the spot since you teed that up for me. And I know your former boss.
I was hoping somebody else would have a wait on that one. It's really hard. This is an area where I don't know that I've necessarily come to a strong conviction, really. And I really appreciate the value of being able to see the communication. I mean, just for myself personally, I follow several of these accounts. I'm very interested in what they have to say. I feel like it's a glimpse into the strategic dynamics, particularly as they often communicate in English, which is for me, handy. But trying to understand where is the state propaganda machine going? And one of the reasons for that, I actually think it's kind of a valuable tool in surfacing dynamics around influence writ large, because one of the things that we see, we just put out a report on a couple of Chinese networks done in conjunction with Twitter, we put it out about 2 days ago. We see what we call full spectrum propaganda. We see a rubric. We look at the broadcast to social, so kind of all of mass media, broadcast and social, recognizing again the strong intersection between those two now, and then across the overt to covert spectrum, right? So are these, is this white propaganda overtly attributed? Is it quote unquote black propaganda, actively misattributed? Where in, the kind of content farms and various fronts in between. And as we look at that, seeing what these accounts are talking about actually does provide a glimpse into where the entire apparatus is going, and that I personally find valuable. I think with the other argument, of course, is from ethics, right? Why do we allow the powerful to have and accrue more power? And that really, I think, is the key trade-off. These accounts, particularly some of the wolf warriors, really grew their followings quite a bit. Whether they're authentically grown or inauthentically grown is a matter of some debate. But there is, again, this the trade-off is really visibility versus the I think the ethical argument that we should not be affording the elite of an undemocratic country the ability to take advantage of democratic broadcast to disproportionately influence the publics of other countries.
So I guess, moving sort of down the scale of severity of interventions by the platforms, one of those is labeling state media outlets and labeling diplomatic accounts. I think probably less relevant or less important for sort of known state actors, the RTs of the world, probably more important for the great propaganda outlets where there may not be the sort of understanding among the public that a particular outlet is being funded by a state actor. So I want to ask again, this is sort of open to the entire panel. Has labeling worked, and could it be done more effectively?
Yeah, I can say something about that. I'm not sure whether it's effective or not, but we think it's not really enough by just labeling all this stuff, because we have been monitoring the state media, like 93 pages for PRC state media on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Weibo. And also we try to monitor the reporters, and there are 96 of them who self-identify them as affiliation with state media, even on all these platforms and Weibo. So, but among all these 93 state media on this platform, only 67 of them got labeled on Twitter, and 53 by Facebook, and only 12 by YouTube, and none on Weibo, of course. But for the reporters, only 13 of them got labeled on Twitter, and 11 of them on Facebook, and only 1 of them on YouTube. So I mean, all this. And also there's another case on Facebook. Most of them have personal accounts rather than fan pages. However, there's an interesting case that the number of Wang Guang is one of the athletes, but right now work for CGTN. His followers dramatically increased from 6 to 458,000 in a year on Facebook, but he has not been labeled. So all these, state-sponsored reporters whose some of them has been labeled, but YouTube merely labels the videos like published by the channels funded by the PRC government. So, Facebook and Twitter's labeling mechanism are like kind of account-centered, and YouTube's are more like video-centered. But the accounts of affiliate reporters are less identified as state-sponsored by social media platforms. But these are the reporters who could generate this information or any propaganda stuff on these platforms, and that's what we observe.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. That's something we've definitely observed in our Hamilton work, is the labeling is incredibly inconsistent, both just from sort of what kinds of accounts will be labeled, but also to clearly accounts that should be labeled that fit within the methodology of how Twitter is defined, what they will label are not. And that obviously creates a problem if you're only sort of labeling half of the accounts you should be labeling, which then gives the sort of perspective to the audience that, well, this account isn't labeled, so I guess it's not a state media account. So yeah, I think that clearly if they're going to label, they need to go all in and be a little bit more precise in what they're doing. All right, I'm gonna turn it over now to Q&A. So the first question, again, any of the panelists feel free to jump in on this. So the question is, deliberate polarization and fomenting of culture wars by domestic politicians is compounding the disinformation problem. At what level should that be tackled? And is it a question of political standards and ethics? I may put you on the spot, Anneli, but sort of limit the question to the German case that we worked on, where at least, again, coming from a US perspective, it was a far more civil election period, and we didn't see politicians amplifying disinformation in the same way that we saw in the US. And it was my perspective that created an environment where disinformation, not that it wasn't a problem around the German election, but certainly less of a problem. Did you feel the same way?
Well, here probably I would say, as someone coming from Finland, I think that the German level of polarization and division and domestic amplification of disinformation was quite significant in my perception when I don't have the similar experience from the US context, so and have followed that only from far. So I guess there are like different levels of perception on this. But what I have been, I mean, of course, it's like clear that that's one of the big questions in governments tackling foreign influence is that the mandate often is limited into the foreign part, and then the domestic side is sort of very problematic to tackle, and then the response is often on the shoulders of civil society and media, resilience building, media literacy, and so on. And in some context, in some countries, that works better, and then in others, it's much more difficult. But I think like from my perspective, and Germany, I think that one of the most worrying developments that I have been noticing is sort of that when this whole thing started, how, for example, Russia was working, that they really needed this kind of laundering through mainstream or reliable media or politicians. And now this information environment has developed in such a way that sort of this is not needed that sense anymore. But the channels are there, they are existing, the audiences are there. You sort of have already your own information space where you can operate and communicate. And you have the consumers as well, who are willing to take it even with the label of state propaganda. So I think that is one of the issues that we would need to focus on in the future.
So there are a few questions that have come through. I'll try to kind of condense them now, because I wanted to also ask this question to all the panelists that essentially get at, should we be more concerned about foreign actors rather than domestic, or at least looking at the nexus between foreign and domestic? Are foreign info ops really only successful when there is a domestic platform for them, when there is this sort of groundwork laid by domestic polarization, but also, I think, as the last question sort of addressed, when you have domestic political actors who will run with those kind of disinfo narratives? So I want to ask each of you to kind of address several of these questions. From where you sit in the world, are you more concerned about foreign, domestic, and I guess I could throw a third one in there, which would be the sort of mercenaries, so the disinfo for hire groups? I'll start with you, Puma.
Yeah, sure. I mean, all these foreign actors could try to amplify the hatred that already exists in our society, and it could be very organic. So what I mean here is that the volume that they could create it, because there's no limit for their budget. But for all these domestic politicians, they still have like a budget for all these political campaign. So that's why I put more emphasis on the foreign influence rather than our domestic one. And also, I think it's kind of important to see how foreign actors try to establish the disinformation market by the approach I call donation approach. So this includes the use of like content prompts and to attract rent seekers. So for example, in 2019, among the top 10 YouTubers who received donations online in Taiwan, 7 of them spread pro-China messages. But when you investigate, there's no official like connections between they and China, because they simply received donations online. And as a new YouTuber, you will know that disseminating all these pro-China messages is a good business. You could like make a lot of money out of it. And also like in one of the group I joined like in 2018, actually China tries to ask someone to disseminate articles and pay for them in foreign currencies. So in the group I joined, people can make like $1,500 per month by simply disseminating all these pro-China articles in Taiwan. So I mean, if there's no budget or if there's no limit of this approach, I think that is something that we should be really aware of, because to fight against this kind of disinformation, which I believe is the most complicated one, we have to investigate the money flow in order to determine the impact of foreign actors. But also because all these actors, all these YouTubers or online influencers, their actions are organic. So you would violate like free speech in this case. So I think it's rather complicated if they're using this kind of approach to establish the disinformation market.
Renée or Lee, I think I can guess at what your answer would be, but sitting in the US, are you more concerned about the foreign or domestic right now?
Domestic, unquestionably.
Domestic as well, though I don't like prioritizing one over the other. I think, I think very much about outcomes. And my biggest concern is what has the potential to lead to real world mobilization, changes in political behavior based on false information, and the potential for escalation to violence. And I think, both domestic and foreign have the capability to do that. So I don't think we should be, kind of picking one over the other in such a way.
So there's a question here that may be slightly difficult for some of you to answer. It's not something I've thought about extensively, but I think it's an interesting question. So it gets to the money flow issue that Puma was just mentioning, and it's, should Western firms be required to limit the amount of money they spend on advertising on high-profile foreign TV, I'm assuming state-backed TV outlets that have been known to spread disinformation?
Maybe I can jump in on this. I mean, I think it is quite shocking to see, for example, Russian TV, and like first you have people shouting how Ukrainians should be hanged, and then after that you have all the Western companies advertising their products. So it does create a very, very like, well, just like quite an awful feeling. So I do think that it would be quite great if these companies also would have a bit of a thought on that. Of course, it would also be great to have that then applied on YouTube, so that you don't have the random ads popping up in the very hostile or toxic YouTube content.
All right, we are getting very short on time. I don't want to run over and keep people, but I did want to kind of wrap out with a question for each of you to answer, and that is the one thing that we should be doing from a whole society perspective. So this can be civil society, it can be government, it could be platforms, it could be individuals. What should we be doing going forward to address this problem? I'll sort of reverse order from where we started. So Lee, I'll start with you here.
Opening up the channels for information sharing and really doing that rigorously. So much of this field is still based on ad hoc relationships, and that's always going to hold us back, I think.
Renée?
I think I would say that too, just kind of solidifying some of the multi-stakeholder relationships that we put in place to have that adaptability and responsiveness.
Anneli.
At this point, I would say that put quite a lot of effort also in real face-to-face comms and like relationship with the audiences, for example, to make sure that in the future also Russians are free to travel to Europe once COVID is over, because I do believe that that is one of the most efficient fact checks that anyone can ever imagine, just having people to see with their own eyes what is happening instead of some propaganda channels.
Yeah, old-fashioned people-to-people diplomacy.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, requires a lot of investment though.
Yeah, and last but not least, Puma.
Okay, so I mean, in addition to like people like to say that Russia like to weaponize social media, I think China is really good at weaponizing citizens, like mafias, religious group, like businessmen. So I think more studies and efforts should be emphasized on this part of like offline disinformation campaign.
All right, well, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. A special thanks to our panel who have joined at some unreasonable hours. Puma, it's pushing, I think, 11 p.m. your time. Renee, I know it's still pre 8 a.m. your time. So a huge thanks to all of you for joining us today. I hope that was a useful conversation that kind of moved the ball down the field a little bit more than just talking about the problem over and over again. So again, thank you all for joining us and have a great day.